Welcome back to Behind the Play. Today we're going to have a bit of a different kind of podcast. I'm joined today by Adam Iafrate, who works for Sportsnet, and we're going to talk a little bit about the NHL trade deadline. That might have been a dud deadline, but there was a lot of big moves leading up to it. So thanks so much for taking the time, Adam, and coming on.
Thanks for having me. And I'm not too typically talking about hockey too much on podcasts, but I love hockey. Obviously, I grew up playing it and big Leaf fan as well. But glad whenever I get the opportunity to talk a little bit about NHL.
Well, thanks so much for coming on. And I think maybe in the future we will have a little segment. I'll preview it a little bit now called Canada's Teams. And I think we'll not just talk hockey. Like you and me are alike in the sense that we both love a bunch of different sports and a lot of Canadian sports. So I think we might have a couple cool segments coming up for listeners. And so stay tuned for that. But first we'll get into the trade deadline. And I just wanted to ask you, Adam, first, like obviously the Leafs made trades, the Oilers made trades, but what trade, not necessarily today, but overall, kind of, do you think made a huge significant shift for a team going into the playoffs that might have swung them into being a cup contender or winning the Stanley Cup?
Oof. There were a lot of really strong low-key moves for contenders. Obviously, listen, I'll start at home in Toronto being a Leaf fan. I think they had a clear idea of what type of player they needed to add. And so Ryan O'Reilly is a winner. He's a captain material guy, a champion. That's the exact type of guy, who's shown he can produce in big moments in the playoffs that you need on your team when you got to get into a 7-game series with a team like Tampa or Boston, who you figure would be on both on your path if you're going to get to a Stanley Cup. So that made a lot of sense. I thought that was a really, really smart acquisition. Obviously, McKay was a great acquisition. That's just the Leafs perspective. Achari is a little bit underrated as well. That's just the Leafs perspective. But outside of that, I mean, I think the big splashes have to be out in New York with the Rangers adding just two really big names. They were a team that has some really exciting players already, and to add Tarasenko and Kane, I don't know if it makes them like a full fledged cup contender favorite. I don't know if they're in that tier or how you want to tier them, but certainly they're big names and they're guys that your attention immediately shifts to New York if we're talking about this deadline because they were the big winners, movers, the team that made the biggest splash, I would say.
Yeah, like I think with your New York Rangers point, like obviously probably, especially if you look at those guys maybe 5 years ago, you're like, oh my God, they got
Yeah,
just maybe two of the kind of top 15, top 20
for
winners
sure.
in the league, right? Now Tarasenko has a good year. Kane had a
Mhm.
really bad year, but was great last year, both on the other side of 30. So I think it's an interesting play for the Rangers. They're big names, but are they kind of in their prime and does it make sense right now with this New York Rangers team?
I don't know. I don't know if it does. That's why I said I'm not so convinced that they're in that contender tier. But it was definitely they were the flashiest moves. They were the biggest name moves. They were the moves that you're like most intrigued about of all the teams after post deadline that you're looking at. Like who am I going to watch if I have like league pass? And I go,
Yeah.
there's every team at my disposal. Like I want to see how the Rangers look with both Tarasenko and Kane in the lineup, along with the stars they already had and fantastic goaltending and Adam Fox and all these fantastic players. Like now they've added two more big names to that squad. So I don't know if it'll work. I don't know if it fits the timeline or if it makes them contenders. There's teams in the East that I still think are better, more well-rounded, probably more positioned to win in the playoffs. But I'm definitely intrigued by New York. I thought the Leafs made a lot of good moves. I thought, like depth moves. You add Lafferty and Achari, two guys to your bottom six, probably. Certainly Achari. I think Lafferty will probably slot in there at in some capacity as well. McCann, Shin. So you kind of solidify your back line. You do give up Sandine, so it's kind of like a give and take
Yeah.
there. But generally, I think they got better at the back. And then the big move was Ryan O'Reilly, of course. So they made a big push. The Bruins made a push with Bertuzzi and Orlov, so they were already stacked. I mean, it's hard to imagine that team getting any better, but they seem to do that. So yeah, there's a lot of good teams, a lot of teams out east that made big moves. Teams that I thought maybe would make more moves that stayed a little quiet. But I thought it was a pretty eventful trade week. Not
Yeah.
today. You alluded to it earlier. Like the deadline day was kind of a dud, but that was to be expected given the amount of movement that happened in the week leading up to deadline day.
As someone, we both also like the NBA. It feels more as though obviously it was a bit of a deadline to make a little joke there, but that there was all these players moving at, and just not just players but big name players moving way ahead of the deadline, and it feels that as though because of the cap and all the minutia that you have to do to retain, to double retain, all that kind of stuff, that it seems as though players are going to be moving more, and we see way more big deals, right? Like I think if Tarasenko and Kane were only traded like in maybe 5 years ago in like the deadline period, you'd say, wow, that was a huge trade deadline. But then you can name Chychrun, O'Reilly, Meyer. Like there's just so many big name guys moving, and I think it's really good for the league itself just to have kind of movement and people interested on who goes where, kind of like the NBA. So I think that's kind of good. Maybe not the salary cap itself, but I think one name that I thought was a bit underwhelming was Timo Meyer. I don't think he got as much. He got 2 firsts. I think there was a condition on the other one, a mediocre prospect and a decent NHLer. But I felt as though it was just a bit underwhelming, and that they could have got more. And I think it's interesting to see New Jersey. They're such a young team, and they just added this huge stud. And those two teams are right now on course to play each other in the first round. And one of those teams is going to go home. And like, especially if you think about the Rangers, they just spent all this draft capital on rentals, right? Well, New Jersey, not so much.
Yeah.
So,
No. It's actually a great show. You could make a really good case. Meyer was the acquisition of the deadline, and he fits a little bit more so their timeline in New Jersey. He's a guy, obviously, that there was a lot of discussion about with the Leafs, especially prior to the O'Reilly trade. Then after that, it didn't really seem so feasible. But that was a big name that they're like, if the Leafs are going to fork up some of their big prospects, it'll be for a guy like Meyer, who's big, physical, skilled, kind of checks all the boxes. And it made a lot of sense to go to a New Jersey team that has a lot of these skilled players that you could fit in with their timeline, and they're going to be, in a tough playoff series with their cross state rivals, or I guess kind of just outside of state rivals. But it'll be really interesting development, I think, for New Jersey to really emerge. Like that's the kind of move you need to make. It reminds me a little bit of when the Leafs acquired Tavares. Like it's like they had these young players, and then they're making this sort of statement of intent. Like now we're ready to contend. And this is the type of move you need to make. You need to splash a little bit of cash, so to speak, send some prospects or some good young players, some picks to make it happen, to add a guy who's like a star who's going to make your team substantially better. So even if that's not the move that necessarily wins you the cup, it's like, it's you're showing the direction you're looking to go. And it's a statement of intent. And so I thought New Jersey did a good job with that. And now there's no question about the direction. Like they're all in on their young core, and they're I think they're a good team. Like they're a team that has I don't think it's going to be this year, but they're a team that has potential for the next few years to build something that maybe they could be a cup contender.
No, I totally agree with New Jersey. I think the goaltending's been better this year. Last year they had atrocious goaltending. Now they have like pretty good, not elite. That's a bit of a question mark. Their decor has been great with Marino. I think I'm curious what you think, but I think Carolina has just put a major dud. They didn't really, I don't think they made any trade. I could be mistaken, but no, they got Goss to spare for a third. But no real big kind of shifting trade. They had their first round picks, and they really, I know they were close on Meyer, I think. But that's a team that's second in the NHL, and they really didn't do much. And I find that a bit baffling. I think, I know they have this thing where they don't like to trade their first round picks. And I mean, I'm not against that. They've built an amazing team, but at the same time, are you ever going to go in all in? And if your players in that dressing room, what are you thinking? We're amazing, and we don't get a Tarasenko, we don't get a Meyer, we don't get a Chychrun, we don't get a, I don't know, O'Reilly.
Any of those guys would have been needle movers for sure. They're a great team though. Like to your point, it's kind of it's an interesting debate, because this year I find once the dominoes start falling, teams like this year was an arms race. Every team was loading up, but not every year works out this way. Maybe this is going to be the new way in the NHL. excuse me, you alluded to it earlier with the NBA being a little bit more like this when one team makes a big move and then all of a sudden all the teams in the conference are like, oh, we gotta match that. We gotta find our own big move. So it felt like that in the NHL this year for the first time, I would say, in a while, where there was really like a legitimate arms race between teams in the Eastern Conference, even in the West to an extent, but more so I find in the Eastern Conference. And yeah, they kind of abstained from that, and they're very good. I don't think they needed to make a move per se to be a contender. I think they were already contenders, but certainly when you look at what Boston did, when you look at what Toronto did, when you look at what New Jersey, New York, like these teams in the East that they may have to go through at some point, they will have to go through some combination of those teams if they're going to go make a Stanley Cup final. And they all made moves, and yeah, Carolina just kind of sat and watched. So we could look back on this and they could be the East's representatives in the Stanley Cup, and we could say, hey, they were able to do that without giving up a first round pick this year, and
Mhm.
building the model that they're very familiar with and turning those first round picks into really good players who produce for them and on good contracts. Or we can look at this and they can be a first or second round exit, losing to one of the teams we just mentioned.
Yeah.
And we can have a very different conversation and perspective about it. So I guess only time will tell. But I was surprised for sure that Carolina didn't push their chips a little bit more to the middle of the table.
And I think your point's really interesting. I think, and to go to the NBA a little bit and the arms race and the philosophy, you see teams like Boston traded 2 first-round picks. Tampa Bay traded all those picks for Tanner Jeannot. The Leafs went in with they traded 2 first-round picks, a bunch of seconds, right? Like they went all in. And I think it's just really interesting to see that, and just the philosophy difference between a team like Carolina that says, no, we're really good, let's just keep the chemistry, no big changes, and then teams like Tampa Bay and the Leafs just throwing draft picks like it's
Yeah.
nothing. And that's a bit like the NBA, and just makes for interesting. Like the Tanner Jeannot trade, everyone just was like, what? It sounded like as though everyone in the NHL front offices were thinking, what? That's for a third line guy. But again, like the Hagel trade, like Barclay Goodrow, trades, they value cap space, and it sounds like they'll sign him and just value that third line. So in Tampa, so I think it's just really interesting how stacked the East is. I've never seen the East this good, especially compared to the West that doesn't seem nearly at the same level.
No, I would agree. I would agree. There's definitely a power struggle right now, and the power isn't East. Excuse me, my voice is giving out right now.
Okay.
I apologize. But
No.
I would agree with everything you said. I think if you're the Leafs, there's a little bit more desperation to make a trade like that
Yeah.
when you compare yourself to like Carolina, for example, who has this young core, hasn't been eliminated in first rounds 6 straight years or wherever it's been for the Leafs. Like,
Yeah.
if you're Dubas, you have no leash. You have to push your chips.
Yeah. No, I completely agree. And I kind of want to go to the kind of our Canada's team segment. I think we've hit it. Or actually, I want to first go to the West a little bit. I think what's interesting is that no one really went all in. The Avs added Korpisalo and Gavrikov, but and I don't think there was any other first round picks that were traded. The Avs kept their pick, the Jets, Dallas, everyone kind of kept their first round picks. So it's really interesting that teams obviously Edmonton traded their first round pick for Ekholm. But yeah, I think do you need some time? Are you okay? Yeah, good. But yeah, so
I'm having a cough attack over here. I have to keep muting
yeah,
myself, but I'm doing great. I'm feeling amazing.
okay, just making sure. But just to
Yeah.
go to that point is that it's interesting that only a couple teams in the West went all in, the Edmontons, the LAs, but they really, and it's wide open, it seems like in the West, while in the East it's just gonna be a battle. And I don't even know who's the last one standing. I think Boston's obviously the best team, but as you said,
Mhm.
like, in the playoffs, like anything can happen, and it'll be really interesting. But it's interesting that it's wide open in the West, and not that many teams went all in. My Jets didn't really make an all in move, and Vegas didn't, which they normally tend to do. So we'll see what kind of happens in the playoffs. And I really like a couple teams out west with Edmonton and the Avs, but again, I've anyone that makes the playoffs in the West, I think could make it to the Stanley Cup Finals.
Yeah, and they have a chance. I think let's start with the Oilers. You mentioned the Ekholm trade. I thought it was a smart trade. I saw some things about he's making too much money. We're locked into this contract. Yada yada yada. The bottom line is when you have 97 on your team, you're a contender. And every year that you let go by that you don't win a cup is a wasted year. And they addressed the need. They had a deficient. They've been one of the teams that's allowed the most goals this season.
Yeah.
Part of that falls on goaltending, but part of that I think their back line is a little bit shaky. And they tried to solidify it with a proven defensive defenseman, a guy who can shut down a top, be a top pairing guy and shut down some of the opponents they're going to have to face in Western playoff series. So I thought it made sense. I think it's the kind of move, again, you got to kind of make a desperation move if you're the Oilers, the Leafs. Like there's teams that have more pressure to make those moves than others. And maybe Carolina, like to your point earlier, maybe they're not one of those teams that feels that they have that pressure yet. Yeah. Every team gets there eventually, but it kind of depends where you are in your cycle, of winning and losing, where the previous successes come from, how long you've had to wait. For teams like Edmonton, you're always going to be in that win now mode as long as you have Connor McDavid on your team. And for the Leafs, I mean, in this market, you have to win, and they haven't won in forever. It's been way too long. So obviously that's the pressure. Everyone's job's on the line if they get eliminated in the first round again, and everyone knows that. So certainly from Dubas's perspective, he knew he had to do some things. Yeah. And whether they end up working out or not, we'll see. But you can't fault him for lack of effort or lack of thoughts and ideas, because he tried a whole bunch of things, and it's a very different roster. I can't remember a team that's sitting as high in the standings as the Leafs making as many changes, like a quantity of changes, as they did in this trade deadline week. Like there's like 7 new faces, and it's like for a team that's having success, that's doing so well, it's very atypical to see that.
Yeah. I mean, I guess my question to you is like someone that, I mean, I follow the Leafs, but I'm not a fan. Are you worried about that there's too much kind of like, I think Elliot Friedman talked about how I think it was on the Fan 590 this morning, that he thought that some people in the Leafs organization were just worried. I think they have like 9 defensemen now, right? Yeah. How do you fit all those egos? Kind of like weirdly more like basketball. Like how do you kind of get everyone to go and be like to steady the shift and all go in the same direction, right? I think they'll be fine. It's hockey, and there's definitely more of that, like kind of for the team, but it'll be interesting to see. But what do you think of Kyle Dubas? And I wonder how you think about this analogy. Do you think he's a free agent at the end of the year? Is he kind of doing a 2015 Alex Anthopoulos and just saying,
I knew you were going to go there for some reason. Maybe
just screw it and throw all the draft picks and let's go all in.
Yeah, but they got a first back, I believe, in the Sandin trade, yeah, right? So, and they didn't end up flipping that one.
No.
So I guess if that was the logic, he probably would have moved that one too. I do think listen, his job's on the line. Like that much I will agree with. So whether he's just throwing caution to the wind and pushing, I think he knows that the Leafs need to get through the first round this year. And if he feels like there are moves that will help do that, even potentially at the expense of some of the future prospects or draft picks, he'll do that. And obviously he did that. So I think there wasn't really much of a choice, though. I mean, when you run the same core back year after year after year, and you lose year after year after year, like you have to, at some point, something needs to give, and you need to make a little bit more of a splash. And I think Brian O'Reilly was that splash. I mean, he's a winner. He's a guy who's done it. He's a guy who's, yeah, sure, on the other side of 30, but not so long ago has lifted a Stanley Cup with a C on his chest. Like that's the type of player you brought into your environment, a winning player who knows how to get it done in the playoffs, who obviously is also very skilled. And then, you complement that move with a top 4 defenseman in McCabe and, some good depth pieces who also have experienced winning culture, like Achari, a guy who's spent, a good portion of his career playing on winning teams, playing playoff type hockey. His game, whether it's in the playoffs or not, is a playoff style of hockey. So I think I'm not worried about the continuity. There are worries for the Leafs for me, but they're more about goaltending, not because they haven't had good goaltending, because I think they actually have, but because they don't have that proven star goaltender that you're going to come against the Vasilevsky. You're going to come against maybe an Allmark, right? So do they have a guy at that level? No, in my opinion, they don't. Can Samsonov or Murray get hot and play at a high level? Yeah. And we've seen Matt Murray win a Stanley Cup doing that. That was a while ago, but we've seen it. So
Yeah, but
can it
that's
happen?
what
Yes, but I wouldn't bet on it.
I mean, as a Sens fan as well, I have to wear both my Jets and Sens cap. But as a Sens fan, that's what we always told ourselves, that Matt Murray would provide for us. He has been good for you guys. He just keeps getting injured every single second. I do think it's interesting though that they not, like, when I saw the O'Reilly trade made sense. I was like, great. And then when I saw the McCabe trade, I was really surprised, because that was really an all in. And you mentioned the Sandin, they got a first back, so that kind of makes sense. I always thought, were they gonna go for Vejmelka, another kind of goalie, because Murray's been so injured and injury prone. But yeah, you really have to get lucky. And I think with Kyle Dubas, he made a big kind of philosophical decision to say, we're not going to have a starting goalie. We're going to go with a tandem and ride the wave. And that's won people cups before. But, and with Matt Murray essentially too, in the 16 and 17 run. But it'll be really interesting to see. I think I actually kind of disagree with you. I think he's done everything to show himself to be the right man for the job. But if you lose, like, what are you going to tell Kyle Dubas to make the team better? Like, this team should have won.
No.
I don't mean that
I
in
actually
a bad way. I just mean, yeah.
I agree with you as well. I'm speaking kind of coming from, I know how this works, in the Toronto market. Like, it's not, you can do a great job, but if they don't win, then people will say he made moves, but they weren't the right moves,
Yeah.
And it's unfortunate, because at the end of the day, you know this, I know this. The players on the ice, the 20 players who dress, they're going to decide whether the Leafs make it past the first round or not. It's not Kyle Dubas. Kyle Dubas, I would agree, has done his job in improving the team from day one to the trade deadline. Like, that's all you can do as a general manager. You can make the team better. And I think, clip as many of these segments on TV that you're hearing as possible, because when things don't work out for the Leafs in round one, and Dubas is on the hot seat, remember what the guys on the TSN panel were saying and the Sportsnet panel were saying about the job that Dubas did at the trade deadline, because it's all revisionist history at that point. Then it's like, they lost, so obviously O'Reilly wasn't the guy to bring them over the hump if they weren't able to win that first round series against Tampa. So unfortunately, that's the way it is. It's sports are very results oriented, and that's not entirely fair to GM sometimes, because they do the things that in theory are the right moves. But if it doesn't work out, I mean, it'll be 7 straight first round exits. Like, you can't hide from that reality either, right?
Yeah, I mean, I do think, I think like the problem is that they've always played Tampa or Boston and teams, like really good teams, and if they were in, I don't know, the Central or the Pacific, they probably have made the conference finals and maybe the Stanley Cup final, right? And I think you have to put more of an onus on guys like Marner, Matthews, especially if you looked at that Habs series. That was probably the biggest indictment of those players, right? Not to rub salt in the wound, and obviously the Nick Foligno trade didn't go well for Dubas, but he got injured, and you can get a guy, and if he gets injured, he gets injured. There's not so much, and Tavares got it. Like, everything kind of went wrong at the same time.
It did. But yeah, like, to your point, you get Tampa, you get Boston in first rounds. How can you really assess the manager for those types of matchups? Those are tough matchups. Even for the best teams in the NHL, those are really tough matchups. So it's kind of unfortunate when the playoff alignment pins you against some of these top teams in round one. But to your point, you get a team on paper in Montreal a couple of years ago who you need to beat, and you lose in 7. Yeah. You get a team. I know this is just immediately post COVID, post COVID break, but you get Columbus in a 5-game series, in a wild card series, and a team that's nowhere near your level, talent wise, and you lose. So I agree with you that you've gotten the short end of the stick matching up with Boston and Tampa every other year, but in there have been series that you've played severely inferior opponents, and on paper, anyways. I know games aren't won on paper, but you haven't won. So the pressure's on the Leafs core for sure. I think everyone I sort of assumed, as good as the team looked last year, that there would be some moves in the offseason, maybe a Nylander, maybe like a big move. I think we all kind of thought a big move was coming, because how can you lose 6 first rounds in a row and not make a drastic change? And they kind of, waited it out and went into the offseason and held their cards tight to their chest. And I think they made the sensible decision, which was not to blow everything up, but to make these small sort of moves to find their opportunities to add pieces during the season, which they did. And I think this is probably the best Leafs team I can remember. It doesn't really matter. It hasn't mattered in the past, but this team probably feels like the most
complete,
cup ready.
Yeah. No, I totally agree. Like, I think this team is by far the best Leafs team I've ever seen. I think they've added a lot, and it'll be really interesting to see how they do against Tampa. That's been such a good team, and I think what will be really interesting to see is, do Austin Matthews and Mitch Marner and William Nylander finally take this team over such a mighty team in the Tampa Bay Lightning, and do they get the goaltending? I think that's the problem is, or maybe not the problem, but the worry is Vasilevsky steals 2 games and you just don't get a game that's stolen for you. But is there anything else on the Leafs kind of deadline and trades and playoffs that you'd want to get into, or we can move on to the Oilers or to another team?
Yeah, no, I think the Leafs did what they needed to do. I'm content with the deadline. I did think there might have been something else coming today.
Yeah.
We alluded to that first round pick that they didn't move in the Sandin trade. So I thought maybe there might have been something there, but obviously it didn't come to fruition. I think if I was a player on the team, I would feel confident about the moves that were made. And they pushed their chips to the middle of the table. Excuse me.
No, that's okay. Yeah, no, I agree. Let's move to another team that put all their chips into the table, and with the Edmonton Oilers. I think what was really interesting is not necessarily that they made that big deal, but that they went for a guy like Ekholm with a lot of term, then go for a rental, and also someone that has such a like high AAV, right? Like, that's not someone that with a team like Edmonton that's so capped out, I guess, and don't really have any cap flexibility, to take someone on like Ekholm is such a big deal. And I mean, he's really good, but he's 32. He's played a lot of playoff games, which is good, but also bad for the body. And I don't know if he's necessarily a good kind of contract long term, but they signed Zach Hyman, they signed Ryan Nugent-Hopkins for 8-year deals. Why are they doing that? Because it's better for the cap, but also because who cares in 8 years? They're going to be McDavid. Well, hopefully McDavid's still there for their own sake, but they need, the cap doesn't matter, and they need to go all in. And I think they did enough. They added Bukestad as well, a good kind of depth forward, third liner. So I think they made enough moves to make it to the finals. Now, do they beat a team in the East? I think they're probably not good enough, but I liken them a lot to the 17 Penguins that didn't really have the greatest decor because Letang was out, and just had Malkin and Crosby at their peak and just dominated teams and strangled you to death and played really smart hockey. And they haven't been a good enough defensive team. Jack Campbell has just been atrocious. But Stuart Skinner's been good. And like, I had Mark Spector on, and he said, well, they probably won't win games 3-2, but they could win 4-3. They're that good offensively. And I really like that line, because I think that's kind of true. Like, McDavid and Draisaitl are that good, and they just need to stop the puck from getting their net just enough to, as stupid as it sounds, it's really true. So yeah.
I agree with you. I mean, we saw it the other day against the Leafs. Like, it's just they can outscore you, even if you're a really good offensive team like Toronto is. They can outscore you because their players are that special, and particularly 97 is that special.
No, I totally agree. And I just want to. Are we still good? Yeah. Do you need a break? So why don't we go a little bit to the Senators, and obviously Chychrun is the big name for the Senators, and as a Sens fan, I couldn't be happier. I think Pierre Dorian just did an absolutely fantastic job. Obviously you're giving up a lot. It's a 2023 pick. It's going to be, I mean, they actually look like they have a chance of making the playoffs now, but even if they don't, it's a 12 to maybe 18 pick probably, in a really, really good draft class. So that's probably more like a 5 or 6 in another year, like next year or something, and 2 second round picks. So yeah, they don't have a lot of draft capital. They don't have a pick till the 4th round this year, which is not the greatest year. So there is like, they're taking a risk, but you have a really, really good player. This team has just been screaming. I think he said everyone knows that the Ottawa Senators are looking for a top 4 defenseman. Pierre Dorian just has really weird quotes. He said he said that he did this for Claude Giroux and stuff like that. But I think what it really does for the team is just address the defense. They're going to have to figure out who they have. 3 out of their 4 best defensemen are lefties. Who goes to the right? They don't have a, like for you guys have a TJ Brody with the Leafs that's a lefty but can play the offside. They don't really have any of Sanderson, Shabbat, or Chychrun that really play it. So they have to figure it out. But again, you get really good players and you figure it out, right? You don't need to worry too much. And I just think this team is really set. And I think next year I think they can sneak into the playoffs, honestly, right now. If you look at the standings, they're 4 points out and they have 3 games in hand on the Islanders. Buffalo's tied with them, have a game in hand on them, but they have a really tough schedule, but I think they have a chance, and you make the playoffs. That's a huge growth. And then next year, maybe you can go to the 3rd round, and then maybe the year after. Obviously, this is wishful thinking, but I really think this just adds to a core that's just so good. And if they can get DeBrincat signed, who's been a bit underwhelming, but still a good player. Stützle looks like a star. Tkachuk looks like a horse, and in the playoffs is just perfect. Like, he's just so good on the boards, hard on the puck, hits, gets underneath your skin. He's nicer than Brad Marchand, but that kind
Only
of
just.
only just. So I think it's just a win-win. And for Doran, you have to give him a lot of credit. Like he said, in the summer, we were linked to Chychrun, and they didn't make the deal because they wanted a Ridley Gregg or 2 first-rounders or whoever it may be. And Dorian waited out the market till he got what he wanted. Kind of like DeBrincat. Like DeBrincat was a first, a second, and a third, but that's not a crazy deal. Like you look at Ekholm, he basically got 2 firsts, right? Or like the Leafs gave up a first and a second for McCabe and Lafferty. O'Reilly was a first, second, third rounder. So I just think it's really good business, and he looked really good, and he's from Ottawa, kind of, or he has like, I think his grandparents are from here. So overall, we definitely won the trade, and I'm just so excited to see them in a couple of weeks when I go to a bunch of games. So yeah.
Yeah, I like what the Sens have done, and on paper they're a juggernaut. I mean, they're a very, very well constructed team on paper. At least they have a lot of good players. To your point, you could sort some of the finer details out, like who's going to shift over to the right side, or those things can happen. But they have talent all across their roster. It's a very good team. Even in a loaded Atlantic division, I wouldn't be surprised at all if they were, right in one of those top 3 playoff spots next year. And they have a shot this year. It's going to take, a strong effort. Somebody did the math on it, and they got to have a pretty good win percentage the rest of the way out to sneak in. But they have a shot, and next year I would say they have a very good chance, even in a division that has Tampa and Boston and Toronto in it.
Yeah, no, I totally agree. And I mean, I don't want to get into the kind of how many points they need, but they've been one of the best teams in the league basically since December. I think they're 11-3-1 in their last 15 or something. So they've been playing well. They have 2 easy games. They play Columbus and Chicago. If they can win that, then you're right there. So I think they still need depth, like to look at a team like the Leafs. Just you look at their 3rd and 4th line, their bottom pair. Well, you guys have, as we said, 9 defensemen. They're not at that kind of depth yet, right?
Yeah.
They really haven't been scoring from their 3rd and 4th lines. I think they're the worst 5-on-5 scoring team in the league, with an amazing power play, like top 5. So those are things they need to get better. But I think with Chychrun, he helps, one, keep the puck out of the net. He's an analytics, for the most part, analytics darling.
Mhm.
And but also can score and give the puck to the forwards, right? And when on this team, when you have Travis Hamonic just icing it every fourth, it's a bit harder. So I think, yeah, I mean, there's not much else I can say other than great job. And yeah, I wanted to go from one team that their fan base is just loving their GM to a team that really is perplexed by their second GM in 2 years with Jimmy Rutherford and Patrick Alvin in Vancouver.
Mhm.
They obviously traded Horvat. I felt that was a bit underwhelming, but they got
Mhm.
assets, and then they make that Hronek trade, and just I do not understand. It doesn't
Nobody
seem,
does.
there's no vision. They're not close. They're what, the sixth or seventh worst team in the league. If you like, what do you think of that?
Yeah, I don't know what to make of it either. You can't be in a position like Vancouver is and be buyers. Well, they're sellers and then they're buyers a week later. I don't know what to make of it either. But giving up a first round pick in this draft class, um, it's illogical. I mean, it's poor management on the. It's the nicest term for it, really.
It's
Incompetence would
unconscionable.
be
Yeah.
probably a more accurate term, but it's really head scratching, and the people of Vancouver deserve better. The Canucks have kind of been in this weird holding pattern for, oh man, a long time, really. Since their cup run, 2010, they haven't really been a team that anyone's looked at as a real contender any year. But they're usually not the worst team in the league either. So they're always in this sort of in between. And there was finally a sense of some direction, maybe when they traded Horvat, where they were heading.
Yeah. And
And then that lasted for like 5 days, and now we don't know who they are again or where they're going. So I'm very confused. I think there's a reason they've been where they have for so long, kind of in purgatory because of moves like this, and I think Vancouver Canucks fans have every right to be a little bit skeptical of their management right now.
yeah, and I think there was all this hope when Rutherford came in that he'd steady the course. They played better last year under Boost Boudreau. And then this year's just been a year from hell, right? Like Boudreau is basically, they're chanting his name because they know he's going to get fired, rather than like the whole world knows he's getting fired. But they just don't do it. Obviously they've had injuries, and then they signed, like, the start of it is JT Miller, right? Like, he
Mhm.
probably could have got a bigger or similar package to Bo Horvat, who's their captain, who doesn't have isn't a tyrant that their best player likes, right? JT Miller, it seems like all indications, does not get along with Elias Pettersson.
Yeah.
And then they make a move like signing Mikheyev as well, who's a good player, got injured and, like, unfortunate, but just, why are you signing guys right now to long-term deals? Look at Kuzmenko, right? Like, they trade Horvat, they sign Kuzmenko for 2 years. It's like, well, you're not winning the cup in 2 years. Why are you could have got a first round pick probably for him. He's been that good, right? Or
Yeah.
2 seconds. It just
There was
does.
a lot of and there was a huge market for JT Miller. I know, like, who wouldn't want to add a goal scorer of his caliber? I think Pittsburgh was big on him, and they were willing to offer. I saw something about multiple firsts. I don't know how true that is, but I mean, he's a very good player. Um, yeah, it's head scratching for sure. Like, I don't understand where they're going. I don't know the rhyme or if there's any rhyme or reason behind who they decide to keep and who goes, but yeah, it doesn't really seem like they know where they're heading.
Yeah, and I mean, there was all these rumors about Brock Besser getting traded, and you're probably trading him as a distress asset rather than as kind of at a good time to do it, right? I mean, he's been a 30 goal scorer, just an elite goal scorer when he's playing well, and you've just kind of, it seems like you've just screwed him up. He's been in trade rumors for 3 years now. And JT Miller, you signed the wrong guy. You should have. I mean, that Horvat deal will be terrible probably too, like the JT Miller deal, but I'd rather have Bo Horvat on my team, and he's your
Yeah.
captain too, right? So I just feel bad. Like, a good friend of mine, Kieran, who I used to do like, just a huge Canucks fan, and he's just in disarray. So It's just sad to see. And I want to move a little bit to my Jets from one fan base that's upset, probably not to the same extent that Canucks fans are, but I know Murat Atesh, who I had on earlier last year before the season, put up a poll to Jets fans just now of how they felt about the deadline, and 15% said they were happy. 85% said they're unhappy. So that kind of shows you, and they've been skidding. I think they've lost 6 out of their last 7. They've kind of playing more like the loosey-goosey team they were last year with no defense. And guys like Mark Scheifele and stuff really not holding their own. But at the same time, as we've mentioned, in the West, it's so open, and they have all their guys are basically expiring next year. They have Hellebuck, Scheifele, Dubois in a way because he's an RFA with 1 year left. So if he took his qualifying 24, Wheeler. So they have all these now Niederreiter, who they just got, right? And why are you not going all in this year to get a Meyer, to get a Chychrun, to get someone to really make this team a cup contender in a West where, sure, if we played the Avs or the Oilers, I'd be scared, but could I see them beating them? Yeah, sure. Hellebuck's an amazing goalie. You have Josh Norrisy, as we say now. Had an amazing year, point a game. If it wasn't for Erik Karlsson, he'd probably win the Norris, right? So it just doesn't make sense. They're kind of half in, half out. They got Nemestikov, cool. That's a third line player, but that's not changing you winning a round in the playoffs, really. And so it just doesn't make a lot of sense. Like, I'd rather have them traded Dubois and Scheifele and just done a tear down for Bedard if they weren't going to go all in with a team that was doing really well until the past kind of 2-3 weeks.
Yeah, and I think, to your point earlier, maybe the piece that's going to win them around is the piece that's already there in Connor Hellebuck. Goaltending, as we know, is the great equalizer and a hot goaltender. I mean, he's one of the best in the league. So when he's on, he's good enough to win you a playoff series. To make a deeper run than that, I'd be a little bit skeptical, because I don't think they're the deepest team. Like, of all the Canadian teams, if I was to put money on who I think could go far, I would say probably I'd put both Edmonton and Toronto ahead of a Winnipeg. Having said that, they do have players who are playoff experienced. They have great goaltenders, so they have a lot of the recipes for teams that can kind of make that one of those surprise runs. But yeah, not doing anything notable at the deadline, or not taking a big swing at the deadline is probably a mistake. And especially when you start to look into their cap situation, and as you're explaining it, this would have been the time to do it. So to not do it now is kind of almost maybe not a full understanding of where you actually are, how close you are, or where the team will be in 2 or 3 years. Because you're right, they could have gone one of two directions. They could have gone full teardown, tank for Bedard, or they could have pushed their chips in the middle of the table. And both of those directions would have made more sense than where they are right now.
Yeah, I know. I totally agree. And the kind of, we talked about New Jersey earlier, and I just wanted to make that point, is that's a team that's up and coming. And if they didn't make a move like a Meyer, it makes sense. Like, they're still a really good team, young. Like, you talk about cycles, they're not in a position where, in 3 years we don't have Jack Hughes or Nico Hischier, maybe not Jesper Bratt, who's might leave, but they have that core in place to be good for a while. With this Jets team, a lot of their guys are in their mid to late 20s or 30s now, with Scheifele and like Hellebuck, right? And so it's just tough to see why you don't go all in when they're all expiring in a year or two. And you don't want all those guys leaving for nothing, right? So unless you somehow extend them all, other than maybe Wheeler, it doesn't really make sense. I think, just rapid fire, I think to touch on the Flames, they didn't really do anything. No. They kind of steadpat. They made a little Dryden Hunt, is that the right name from you guys?
It's a periphery move, and that's another team. I know we're gonna just sort of skim over them, but
yeah,
what an interesting team the Flames are, with the offseason they had and the retool as opposed to the total rebuild. Because if you're going to trade your two best players, you can get a lot of assets for them, but they opted in a different direction to go for a team that would for return rather that would keep them competitive in the West.
Yeah.
And it looked good for a while. But now the wheels have sort of fallen off recently, and for them to stay pat, essentially, that I would put that in a tier with any of the other teams you mentioned as one of the big head scratchers, because they don't have a direction either. A lot of these, that's the thread with these Canadian teams, is like they're not a young team, they're not currently in a playoff spot, and they might not make the playoffs, and they don't really have an exciting future. I wouldn't say you kind of know what you're going to get with this group now. So I don't know what the Flames are thinking either.
It's interesting. I forget who it was. I heard it today, and there's been so many insiders speaking. So, like whoever said this on TSN or Sportsnet, I'm sorry, but I think it was Friedman, or it might have been Dreger, but I think it was Friedman, said that basically teams were asking them about guys like, I think, Lindholm and other players that are kind of expiring. They didn't have any big expirings this year, but a lot of good players expiring in 2024, to kind of see where they're at. And the Flames are like, well, we don't really know. We don't know what this team is, right? And then Markstrom's been atrocious. They've got really, like, I think they're probably a playoff team if they got league average goaltending, right? And haven't. But there's also a lot of new pieces. They have Kadri, Huberdeau, Uyghur, kind of big foundational. And then you have all these, obviously, Tkachuk and Gaudreau that left. So I think you're right. They're a really interesting team. And I think they did the right thing to kind of what's the point in adding, and if you're going to trade guys away, make it an off-season thing, because I don't know. I still think if kind of they get goaltending, they could be a really good team. And if they snuck into the playoffs, like, that'd be great. But if they don't, they'll have a great pick in a deep class. So I think they did the right thing, but it's interesting that it seems like they even didn't know what to do.
No, not at all. And to the point of, I will agree with, like, I would fully expect Markstrom to have positive regression, because I believe in him as a goaltender. I think he's very talented. I've liked him from his Vancouver days as well. But yeah, not having a good year, so you can't. It's hard in general when you just don't get a lot out of that position in the National Hockey League in today's game. Like, that's an area you can't afford to be bad. And but I would, if I was I am a betting man. If I was to bet on the Flames, I would bet that they have a big bounce back year with regards to the goaltending next year. So if they keep the pieces around, the idea is they actually believe they're better than they really are, or than they've showed this year.
I mean, I don't know if we can go into it too quickly, but I do wonder the status of Daryl Sutter with this team, because they really underperformed in the playoffs last year. They just got smoked by that Oilers team. They just gave up all those goals. What was it, 9-7, 9-6 that first game? I forget.
Oh God, yeah. It's something like that.
Yeah, I could be wrong, but it was a lot of goals. And
Yeah.
And just I think it was Peltier. He had his first game, and Sutter kind of had the post-game press conference and just said, "Oh, I didn't see number 12 on the ice," or like kind of was snarly. And I just think in today's game with young people, that's just not how you treat them. Like that's just not what you
He's
do.
very old school. He's very old school. And I agree with you. I think if I was a player in today's game, I would probably like want to tell him where to go. But
Yeah,
that's
and
really
I
good or there.
in that he's a complete. I think players have seemed to like him. He won cups. Now that doesn't mean people liked you. Look at Mike Babcock, but I just think that kind of coach doesn't seem to really make a lot of sense now. And I just wonder if they got another coach, if that would maybe be something kind of like the Jets did this year, where they just said, "Hey, it's the coach. Let's come back, see where we are, and maybe get a positive regression with Markstrom and all that." I think to move on to the last Canadian team in the Habs. I mean, they didn't really do anything, all very peripheral moves. I thought they'd do more. Obviously, they traded Dadonov for Gurionov, which is like an interesting play. But I guess Monahan, it sounds like they found out today that he might not be back this year. They didn't trade Edmondson, who has a year left. But if I'm a Habs fan, do I say, should we have tried harder to be like Chicago and the Ducks and really tank for Bedard? Because right now they're the 5th or 6th worst team.
Yeah. Yeah, the answer is probably yes. Because what else are you playing for at this point? Um, and especially with any expiring contracts, like you mentioned, like what's the purpose? If you can get assets for them, why not? If they make your team even incrementally worse, why not? Because at this point, that's you're the draft lottery is your Stanley Cup if you're a Habs fan. So yeah, that's a bit of a head scratcher. I mean, they are going to probably have a top 5 pick,
Yeah.
and it might be first if they're very lucky. But yeah, I'm surprised they weren't selling a little bit more aggressive.
Yeah, no, I mean, I'm just gonna get it up right now, but I believe they're the 6th worst team in the league. Like they're very close. Yeah, they're the 7th, I think. Quick math. But yeah, so it's a bit,
Feels
but
like they're worse than that.
yeah, no, I mean, on the ice, like you see the Canucks and they have talent, and you see the Habs and they don't, other than maybe Suzuki, right? I think Montembeau has been really good for them, which is interesting. I mean, that's the thing. Goaltending can be weird. You find a guy
It
who's
is.
30 and just has a career year and then sucks for the rest of his career, but they've actually had very good goaltending, so I think that's a bit of it. But they're in the right direction. I think we'll see with the odds. Like if they get Bedard, if they get a Fantilli, even a top 7 pick, it sounds like will be a big game
In
changer.
this class. Yeah.
But if they get a Bedard, if they get a Fantilli, like you can see them being pretty good with all the picks they've accumulated. They have another top pick with that Ben Sherratt trade, which is just like you should win GM of the year for that trade right now, because that's going to be probably a top 15 pick in a loaded draft class for Ben Sherratt, who's just atrocious. Or yeah, so but good for them. Is there anything else you'd want to touch on the Habs?
No, as a general rule, I like to not talk about the Habs.
Yeah, fair enough. Fair enough. I think
No,
before we go,
no.
I wanted to quickly go to which team had the best deadline in your opinion, and which team had the worst deadline in your opinion.
The best, New Jersey and Ottawa, but I
Mm.
don't think it makes them contenders. So for that reason, I'll say Boston or Toronto. Boston's finessing of the cap is to be commended.
Bonus, the bonus.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, exactly. They're playing Tampa, but they're I mean they made a fantastic roster better somehow, so they have to be up
Orlov
there.
has like 3 goals in 4 games with them.
Yeah, yeah.
Crazy. Yeah.
It's unbelievable. So Boston and Toronto, I would say. I'm trying not to be too biased towards the Leafs, but I do think they had a really good deadline. So I think you have to tip your cap when it's appropriate. And I think this is one of those times where it was appropriate. But yeah, Ottawa and New Jersey are my honorable mentions, and of course the Rangers because of the splash they made. Whether it works out or not will be seen soon. But they certainly like push their chips in the middle.
Yeah. No, I totally agree. I think I'm gonna say like I'm a homer with the sense. I think they had the best trade, like the best just smart like not bargain because they gave up a lot, but just reading the market, getting the guy they need at the right price and everything. I actually I think I'm gonna go with the Leafs. I think they really added. I remember seeing the McCabe trade and Lafferty and thinking, wow, okay, like they're really good. Like I really like the O'Reilly trade. I thought Achari was a really underrated player to get back in that. Dubas always likes to get 2-for-1s, or like 2 players in a trade. That's his thing with the same team.
Yeah,
So I really like. I think Boston got better, but at the same time, you like what are you doing to a Porsche? You're just making it slightly better. Like they're
yeah.
perfect. Obviously you can always get better, but I don't know if them getting those guys really changed how I saw them necessarily. But with the Leafs, I really felt they made their forward group better. They made their decor better. And
Mhm.
I can't think of another team that really, in my opinion, as we started the show, pushed them from a team. I thought they were really good before, but to a team, I can see them winning the cup if things fall their way.
Yeah.
And if they had got Karel from Melko with that first round pick, I probably would have said I really, really like them even more to make it out of the East. But I think that's it. And maybe my worst deadline, I think just Arizona. I'm just
The
gonna say
whole, yeah, the whole state of Arizona needs to go.
Screw KD and the Suns. But yeah, no, I think just the Chychrun trade, they just blew their hand. They're getting Voracek. I think it doesn't make. They're just circumventing the cap. I think every talk radio show said that after the Chychrun and Voracek trade with regards to Arizona, just because they're just taking guys that have played 10 years ago and using their old contracts to get to 62 million or whatever the cap floor is. And
it's bad. It's really the whole, I mean, that's a whole other podcast topic, but what's happening in Arizona in the NHL is like really disappointing for the league. And I think hopefully they come to a resolution sooner rather than later that doesn't involve the team playing in Arizona. That's just, I'm sure it's not just my opinion. I'm sure it's many people's opinions. But.
And just at the very least, not playing in a 5,000 seat arena when ASU, the college, gets first dibs on home games. Maybe that would be better, Gary. Well, Adam, thanks so much for going through this, and I know you've been sick throughout this a little bit, so yourself and keeping the conversations great, and I hope to have you on sometime soon, and not just for hockey, but I mean, we're alike in the sense that we both love a billion different sports, not always the same teams, as Manchester United beat you last weekend, but I'm just really excited for this, and thanks so much for taking the time.
I really appreciate it. Thank you for having me on. And I can say safely, I've done a lot of interviews, and this is the toughest one I've ever had to do. If you're listening to this, an audio version, you don't see me just absolutely choking on myself every 15 seconds, but it's been a brutal hour. So I appreciate you bearing with me and just trying to let me figure out how to get words out of my mouth. But I'd love to come on in the near future and hopefully not have that problem.
Yeah, I know. I'm sure next time we'll get good, and I'll send you a bunch of cough medicine just time, just to make sure you're ready. So, well, thank you so much, and listeners, stay tuned. We have some cool guests coming up for basketball, hockey. Stay tuned, and yeah, take care, guys.